What happens when a group of racist bullies targets the wrong black man, mistaking his calm demeanor and imposing size for weakness? Watch as a retired Marine refuses to back down, standing firm against a gang bent on controlling a small town. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, its dusty heat blanketing the quiet streets, as Mac Davis stepped out of his worn, old pickup truck. A man of impressive stature, Mac carried an aura of composed strength. His broad shoulders and barrel chest were unmistakable signs of someone you wouldn't want to challenge lightly. The Marine Corps cap perched snugly on his head provided shade from the relentless glare, while his eyes scanned the sleepy town streets. This was meant to be his fresh start, a peaceful escape from the chaos he had left behind in the city. Just 2 days earlier, Mac had moved into a modest house on the town's outskirts. His plan was straightforward: teach fitness classes at the community center, embrace the quiet, and finally let life slow down. As he strolled toward the diner on the edge of town, Mac couldn't help but notice the lingering glances from passers-by. They weren't openly hostile, but the stares lasted a bit too long, their curiosity tinged with barely concealed judgment. The diner stood as a relic of simpler times, its neon open sign flickering unevenly against the sun-bleached walls. Inside, the aroma of fried food and coffee should have felt comforting, but instead, it carried an undertone of unease. Mac slid into a booth by the window, savoring the relative quiet. A waitress approached, her tired eyes betraying years of hard work. She offered a polite but cautious smile. "Coffee?" she asked, pen poised over her notepad. "Please," Mac replied, his voice deep and steady. "And whatever special you've got." She nodded and quickly retreated. Mac didn't dwell on it. He was used to being misjudged, his imposing size often misinterpreted as a threat. As he adjusted the Marine Corps ring on his finger, his thoughts wandered, the stillness almost soothing. The peaceful moment shattered as the bell above the diner door jingled. 3 men entered, their raucous laughter slicing through the subdued hum of the diner. Mac glanced up briefly. The leader, a wiry man with a cocky swagger, locked eyes with him and smirked. His 2 companions, following close behind, moved with calculated confidence. The leader's voice, loud and dripping with mockery, echoed through the diner. "Well, look at that," he drawled, nodding in Mac's direction. "Big guy thinks he owns the place." Mac's hand tightened around his coffee cup. So much for a peaceful new beginning. The atmosphere shifted as Derek and his gang made their entrance. Conversations that had filled the room moments earlier fizzled into murmurs, replaced by the arrogant cadence of Derek's voice. Mac had seen men like Derek before, loud, overconfident, and masking insecurity with bravado. Keeping his eyes down, Mac stirred his coffee, hoping they'd lose interest and move on. But luck wasn't on his side. Derek approached Mac's booth with exaggerated steps, his smirk growing wider with every stride. Trailing behind, Jake and Evan mirrored his grin like shadows, their expressions oozing smugness. The 3 men loomed over Mac's table, their presence casting a dark shadow. "Hey, big guy," Derek sneered, his tone laced with ridicule. "Didn't know the circus was in town." Mac remained unfazed, taking a slow sip of coffee. He'd learned long ago that silence often disarmed fools better than words. But Derek wasn't after silence. He wanted a reaction. "What's the matter?" Jake chimed in, his voice equally grating. "Too busy counting calories to say hi?" Their laughter erupted as Evan leaned against the booth, pretending to inspect Mac's plate. What happens when a group of racist bullies targets the wrong black man, underestimating him because of his quiet nature and formidable size? Witness as a retired Marine stands his ground, unshaken, against a gang determined to dominate a small town. The dusty heat of the afternoon sun was merciless, draping the quiet streets in its relentless embrace. Mac Davis climbed out of his worn, battered pickup truck. With a towering frame and an air of calm strength, Mac carried himself in a way that made it clear. He wasn't a man to be trifled with. His Marine Corps cap, snugly fitted on his head, shaded his sharp eyes as they scanned the sleepy surroundings. This was supposed to be a fresh start for him, far away from the chaos he'd left behind in the city. Just 2 days earlier, he'd moved into a modest house on the outskirts of town. His plans were simple: teach fitness classes at the community center, enjoy the quiet, and finally allow life to slow down. But as Max strolled toward the diner at the town's edge, he felt the weight of lingering stares. They weren't openly hostile, yet they lasted too long, their curiosity poorly masking judgment. The diner itself was a relic of another era, its flickering neon open sign barely cutting through the afternoon glare. Inside, the scent of fried food and coffee filled the air, a blend that should have been comforting but instead carried an odd tension. Max slid into a booth near the window, relishing the temporary quiet. A waitress approached cautiously, her polite smile shadowed by weariness. "Coffee?" she asked, pen poised over her notepad. "Please," Mac replied, his deep voice steady. "And whatever special you've got." She nodded and retreated quickly. Mac didn't give it much thought. He was accustomed to being misunderstood, his imposing size often seen as a threat rather than strength. Adjusting the Marine Corps ring on his finger, he let his mind drift, waiting for his meal. The peaceful lull shattered as the diner door's bell jingled. 3 men entered, their loud laughter cutting through the muted conversations like a blade. Mac glanced up briefly. The leader, wiry and brimming with cocky swagger, locked eyes with him and smirked. His 2 companions followed close behind, their movements deliberate, their confidence radiating. "Well, would you look at that?" the leader drawled loudly, nodding toward Mac. "Big guy thinks he can take over our booth." Mac's hand tightened around his coffee cup. So much for a quiet start. The diner's atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations that had flowed moments ago now dwindled to whispers, replaced by the arrogant cadence of Derek's voice. Mac had seen men like Derek before, loud, brash, and hiding insecurity under layers of bravado. Keeping his gaze fixed on his coffee, Mac stirred it deliberately, silently hoping they'd move on. But luck wasn't on his side. Derek strutted toward Mac's booth, his exaggerated steps making his smirk grow with each stride. Behind him, Jake and Evan mirrored his expression, their smug grins shadowing his movements. "Hey, big guy," Derek sneered, his tone mocking. "Didn't know the circus was in town." Mac remained composed, taking a measured sip of his coffee. He had learned long ago that silence often disarmed provocateurs better than words. But Derek wasn't after silence. He craved a reaction. "What's the matter?" Jake chimed in, his voice equally grating. "Too busy counting calories to say hi?" Their laughter echoed loudly, Evan leaning in to inspect Mac's plate with exaggerated curiosity. "Man, with all that weight, you must have been first in line for breakfast," Evan jeered. "Or second, third, and fourth." Mac's jaw tightened, but he remained calm, cutting into his chicken-fried steak deliberately and taking a slow bite. His composed demeanor only seemed to irritate Derek further. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Derek snapped, slamming his hand on the table. The sharp sound silenced the room, all eyes now on the confrontation. Mac raised his gaze, his expression neutral but unyielding. "I didn't realize this was your booth," he said evenly, his deep voice carrying quiet authority. "If you want it, take it. I'm just here to eat." Derek's smirk faltered momentarily, but returned as he chuckled. "Nah, I'm good right here. Gives me a better view of whatever this is." He gestured dismissively at Mac. "Man, how do you even fit through doors?" Jake and Evan burst into laughter again, their taunts turning louder, more aggressive. The waitress, standing nervously at the counter, cast a hesitant glance in their direction, but made no move to intervene. Mac set down his fork, leaning back in his seat. His eyes locked on Derek's, calm but unyielding. "Are you done?" he asked simply. Derek's grin twisted into a sneer. "Done? Oh, we're just getting started. Look at you. A guy like you. Bet you don't even work, huh? Probably just sitting around all day, milking the system." Mac's fingers curled into a fist beneath the table, his restraint hard-won through years of discipline. His training had taught him to pick his battles, to rise above petty provocations. "Why don't you sit down and enjoy your lunch?" Mac suggested, his tone calm but firm. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Derek let out a harsh laugh that filled the room. "End? What's that supposed to mean? You threatening me, fat boy?" Evan and Jake leaned closer, their smug grins fading into something darker. The air grew heavy, tension thickening with every second. Mac met Derek's stare, unwavering. "I belong wherever I decide to be," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "And I'm not going anywhere." For a moment the room was still, the weight of Mac's words hanging in the air. The diner's atmosphere had reached its breaking point, the tension so thick it felt like a storm ready to explode. Derek stood still, his jaw clenched and fists trembling. His sneer was now more of a grimace, betraying the cracks in his bravado. Jake and Evan shifted uneasily, the weight of Mac's calm yet unyielding presence pressing on them like a physical force. Mac remained rooted in his spot, towering over them with an aura of quiet authority. His eyes, sharp and steady, scanned each of the men in turn, as though silently daring them to make their next move. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint hum of the diner's refrigerator and the muffled whispers of patrons too afraid to intervene. "You're not as tough as you think," Derek spat, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and doubt. "We run this town. People like you don't get to walk in here and act like you belong." Mac's response was measured, his tone steady. "People like me?" He stepped forward, just enough to make Derek instinctively lean back. "You mean people who stand up to bullies? Who don't let ignorance and fear dictate where they live or who they are?" Jake glanced at Derek, his earlier smugness fading into discomfort. "Derek, maybe we should." "Shut up, Jake," Derek barked, his voice cracking. He turned back to Mac, desperately clinging to his dwindling dominance. "This isn't over. You don't belong here, and you'll see that soon enough." Mac tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "The thing about men like you, Derek," he said, his voice calm yet cutting, "is that you confuse fear with respect. But all you're earning here is pity." The words hit Derek harder than any punch could. His face flushed a deeper red, and for a moment he looked like he might lunge again. But Jake and Evan, both now visibly shaken, grabbed his shoulders. "Let's go," Jake urged, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll deal with him another time." Derek hesitated, his pride warring with the realization that Mac wasn't backing down. Finally, with a sneer that was more self-preservation than bravado, he yanked himself free from Jake and turned toward the door. "This isn't over," he growled, casting one last glare at Mac. "You're gonna regret this." Mac didn't respond. He simply stood tall, his gaze following them until they disappeared through the door, their departure punctuated by the jingle of the bell above it. The silence lingered, thick and uneasy, before the hum of conversation cautiously returned to the diner. The waitress reappeared from the kitchen, her eyes wide with a mix of relief and admiration. She hesitated before approaching Mac's table. "You okay?" she asked softly, her voice laced with concern. Mac nodded, his features softening slightly. "I'm fine," he replied, settling back into his booth. "Sorry for the trouble." The waitress shook her head. "They were the trouble, not you. Nobody's ever stood up to them like that before." Her eyes flicked to the door, as if expecting them to come back. Maybe things will change now." Mac offered a faint smile, though his thoughts were clouded with uncertainty. He'd faced battles before, on and off the field, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about him. It was about a community trapped under the thumb of men like Derek, and the courage it would take to break free. He turned back to his plate, the food cold now but still comforting in its familiarity. As he took a bite, the hum of the diner grew a little louder, the air slowly returning to normal. Mac knew this wasn't the end. Derek and his crew would be back. But for now, he was content to finish his meal and savor the small victory of standing his ground. The diner's dim hum buzzed beneath Derek's venomous growl. "Get him!" His voice cut through the air like a whip, but underneath the anger was a tremor. Fear, desperation. Jake lunged first, his charge clumsy but fueled by bravado. Mac shifted easily, sidestepping with the precision of a seasoned fighter. Gripping Jake's arm, Mac twisted and shoved, sending him sprawling into a booth. The impact rattled the wooden frame, the plates on the table clattering like a symphony of defeat. Jake groaned, clutching his side, while Mac already turned to face the next threat. Evan hovered, fists half raised, his hesitation palpable. "Don't just stand there, you idiot!" Derek's bark broke through his paralysis. With an awkward burst of energy, Evan lunged. His punch was wild, his aim desperate. Mac caught the swing effortlessly, twisting Evan's arm in a controlled motion and redirecting him into a table. Plates and glasses crashed to the floor as Evan doubled over, clutching his ribs with a pained yelp. Derek's fury boiled over. With a guttural roar, he rushed at Mac, fists flying. The first strike missed, Mac dodging it smoothly. The second, blocked with a forearm. But Derek pressed forward, relentless. He swung again, only for Mac to step in close, gripping Derek by the collar. With a controlled force, Mac hoisted Derek off his feet and slammed him into the wall. The impact sent a framed picture crashing to the floor, shards of glass scattering like fallen resolve. Mac's voice was low and steady, each word weighted with power. "You done yet?" Derek squirmed in his grip, his eyes darting around the diner. His bravado cracked, the confidence drained from his face. Jake staggered to his feet, still clutching his side, while Evan leaned heavily against a booth, his expression pale and uncertain. Both men glanced at Derek, waiting for a cue that never came. "This isn't over," Derek spat, his voice cracking under the weight of humiliation. Mac released him with a sharp shove, sending him stumbling into Jake, who barely managed to steady them both. Jake's voice slurred with desperation as he echoed his leader. "Yeah. You're done. You don't belong here." Evan muttered something unintelligible, his eyes darting nervously between the exit and Derek. Derek pointed a trembling hand at Mac, his glare a mix of rage and shame. "You'll regret this. You'll see." The trio bolted for the door, their retreat clumsy and disorganized. The bell above the door jingled violently as Derek shouted one last threat over his shoulder. "We'll make you pay." Mac stood in the center of the diner, his breathing steady, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage. Chairs lay overturned, plates shattered, and the patrons sat frozen in stunned silence. The waitress peeked out from behind the counter, her face pale but her eyes wide with admiration. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," Mac replied, his tone calm but firm. "Call the police." "I already did," she said. "They're on their way." Moments later, the wail of sirens pierced the night. 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of the diner, their lights flashing. The officers stepped inside, their gazes moving from the destruction to Mac. One of them, tall and stocky with a buzz cut, approached cautiously. "What happened here?" he asked, his tone clipped and professional. Mac crossed his arms, meeting the officer's gaze with unflinching steadiness. "I defended myself." The waitress stepped forward, her voice hurried. "It wasn't his fault. Derek and his friends, they started it. They've been causing trouble around here for years." The officer's expression shifted at the mention of Derek's name, a flicker of recognition darkening his features. "You're new in town, right?" he asked Mac. Mac nodded. "Just moved here." The officer exchanged a glance with his younger partner, who looked uncomfortable as he surveyed the scene. "Derek's known to us," the older officer admitted cautiously. "But you seem to have made quite an impression." Mac's jaw tightened. He could hear the unspoken skepticism in the officer's voice, the subtle implication that a new guy must have provoked the gang. "I didn't start this," Mac said firmly. "But I finished it." The waitress nodded vigorously. "He's telling the truth. Derek and his crew came in, started harassing him, and wouldn't stop. They've done this to other people too." The officer sighed, running a hand over his buzzed hair. "Yeah, we've heard complaints about them. Hard to get anything to stick, though." Mac's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me they've been doing this for years, and no one stopped them?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We do what we can, but people around here don't like to talk. Derek's family has connections." Mac's expression hardened. "Connections or not, they just threatened me. Are you planning to do something about that?" The officer hesitated, then gestured toward the mess. "We'll file a report. If they come near you again, let us know." Mac didn't respond. He'd seen the reluctance in their posture, heard it in their words. Derek and his gang had been allowed to terrorize the town unchecked, shielded by the power of their family's influence. As the officers began taking statements, Mac stepped outside. The cool night air hit his face as he stood on the diner steps, Derek's parting words echoing in his mind. "We know where to find you." This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The silence in the council chamber was deafening. Mac's words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. The thick folder of evidence he held seemed heavier than its weight, each page representing the fear and pain of a town forced into submission. "This isn't just about a few vandals," Mac said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "It's about a system that's let them thrive. A system that's looked the other way while families were driven out, while businesses were destroyed, and while good people were made to feel like they don't belong here." The room shifted uneasily. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one dared speak up. Mac's gaze swept the council members, lingering on each face as he measured their reactions. One man, older with a stiff posture, cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "Mr. Davis," he began, his tone hesitant, "these are serious accusations. Do you have proof?" Mac stepped forward, holding the folder high. "Right here. Testimonies, photos, records, everything your police department has conveniently ignored or dismissed. And if you won't act, I'll make sure someone higher up does." A younger councilwoman leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Mr. Davis, we need to handle these matters carefully. Accusations like this could damage reputations." "Reputations?" Mac's voice rose, not in anger, but in righteous indignation. "What about the reputations of the families who were forced to flee? The businesses that were ruined, the lives that were destroyed because this council didn't want to rock the boat. The crowd began to shift. Whispers turned to murmurs, and a few heads nodded in agreement. Mac could see the tide turning. He wasn't just speaking for himself, he was giving a voice to the silenced. "I'm not here to make threats," Mac continued, his tone firm. "I'm here to make it clear. This ends now. Either you take action, or I will. And I promise you, when the spotlight shines on this town, everyone will see what's been allowed to happen here." The council sat frozen, their discomfort palpable. Finally, the mayor, a wiry man with glasses perched low on his nose, spoke. "Mr. Davis, we'll review your evidence. If there's merit to your claims, appropriate actions will be taken." Mac's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I'll hold you to that." As Mac left the meeting, he felt the weight of a dozen gazes on his back. Outside, the cool night air greeted him, sharp and bracing. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Mac continued his crusade. With Evan's information, he uncovered more about Derek's network, how they targeted specific people, how they coordinated their harassment, and, most damningly, how they were protected by the town's elite. Mac didn't just gather evidence. He built a narrative, one that couldn't be ignored. The turning point came when Mac reached out to a local journalist. Her name was Lisa Carter, a young reporter with a reputation for exposing corruption. When Mac showed her the dossier, her eyes widened. This is big," she said, flipping through the pages. "If even half of this is true, it's going to shake this town to its core." "It's all true," Mac said. "And it needs to come out." Lisa got to work immediately, cross-referencing Mac's evidence, conducting her own interviews, and piecing together a comprehensive exposé. When her article finally hit the front page, it sent shockwaves through the town. "A town held hostage, the untold story of fear and corruption," the headline read. Names were named, connections exposed, and Derek's reign of terror was laid bare for all to see. The backlash was immediate. Derek's father, once a respected businessman, found himself facing scrutiny and public outrage. Town officials who had turned a blind eye were forced to answer uncomfortable questions. And Derek himself? He became a pariah, his once feared gang scattering as the pressure mounted. One evening, Mac found himself back at the diner. The atmosphere was different now, lighter, freer. The waitress from that fateful night approached him with a smile. "You really did it," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. Mac shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. The people of this town did. They just needed someone to remind them they didn't have to be afraid." She nodded, her smile widening. "Still, you're the reason they found their courage." Mac didn't respond, but a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He sipped his coffee, gazing out the window at the town he now called home. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was changing, and for the first time, Mac felt like he truly belonged. The fight reignited like a storm breaking over the horizon. Derek charged forward with reckless abandon, his fists flying in wild arcs. Jake flanked him, his movements slower and more cautious, clutching his side where Mac's earlier strike had left its mark. The two moved in tandem, their desperation lending a dangerous edge to their attacks. Mac stood firm, his feet planted like roots into the earth. His calm was unshakable, born from years of facing far greater threats than these. As Derek lunged, Mac sidestepped with practiced ease, catching Derek's wrist mid-swing and twisting it sharply. Derek cried out in pain, his body jerking as Mac used his momentum to flip him onto the ground. Jake took advantage of the distraction, rushing at Mac with a low tackle. Mac barely had time to pivot, catching Jake by the shoulder and redirecting his momentum. Jake stumbled forward, colliding with the truck once more, the impact echoing in the still night. "Enough!" Mac barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a thunderclap. He turned to face Derek, who was scrambling to his feet, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You're done. You've already lost. Don't make me do this again." But Derek wasn't listening. His pride was wounded, and his desperation was clouding his judgment. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice a venomous hiss. "You don't get to walk away from this. This is my town." Mac shook his head slowly, disappointment etched into his features. "This was never your town, Derek. It belongs to everyone who lives here. And they're not afraid of you anymore." As Derek prepared to charge again, Mac's gaze flicked to Evan. The young man was frozen in place, his eyes wide and darting between Derek and Mac. His hands hovered uncertainly at his sides, and his body seemed to scream hesitation. "Evan," Mac said, his voice softer now, almost pleading, "you don't have to do this. Walk away. Right now. It's not too late." Evan's lips parted, his gaze locking with Mac's for a brief moment. In that moment, Mac saw the fear, the doubt, and the glimmer of a conscience fighting to break free. "Don't listen to him," Derek snapped, his voice cracking with anger. "If you walk away now, you're done. You hear me? Done." But Evan hesitated. His feet shuffled backward, his body inching away from the confrontation. Maybe we should just leave," he muttered, barely audible. Derek spun on him, his face a mask of fury. "What did you say?" he growled, taking a threatening step toward Evan. "You're not chickening out on me now. Get in there." For a moment, Evan looked like he might comply, his body moving on autopilot under Derek's oppressive glare. But then Mac stepped forward, his towering presence drawing Evan's attention once more. "Look at him," Mac said, his voice steady and commanding. "He's not your friend. He's using you. And when this is over, he'll leave you to deal with the fallout. Walk away, Evan, before it's too late." The words hit their mark. Evan's shoulders sagged, and his trembling hands dropped to his sides. He took another step back, then another, until he was well out of reach. I can't do this," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm out." "Coward!" Derek bellowed, his rage now fully directed at Evan. "You're nothing without me. Do you hear me? Nothing." But Evan was already retreating, his face pale and his steps quick as he disappeared into the shadows. Mac watched him go, a flicker of relief crossing his face. At least one of them had made the right choice. Derek, now left with only Jake at his side, turned back to Mac. His chest heaved with exertion and fury, but there was a crack in his bravado. His fists clenched, but his stance wavered. Even Jake seemed to hesitate, glancing between Derek and Mac as if questioning the wisdom of continuing the fight. "This is over," Mac said again, his voice low and final. "Go home. Think about what you've done. And don't come back." For a moment, it seemed like Derek might heed the warning. His eyes darted to Jake, who gave a small, uncertain nod. But Derek's pride refused to let him back down completely. With a frustrated snarl, he spat on the ground at Mac's feet. "You haven't seen the last of me," he hissed. "This isn't over." Mac didn't flinch. He stood tall, his gaze unwavering as Derek and Jake turned and slunk back to their car. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off into the night, leaving Mac alone in the quiet street. The silence that followed was heavy but not oppressive. Mac took a deep breath, letting the tension drain from his body. He knew this wasn't the end of the fight. Not entirely. But it was a turning point. Derek's grip on the town was loosening, and Mac had no intention of stopping until it was gone completely. He turned toward his house, his footsteps echoing softly in the night. Behind him, the street was empty, the air still and calm once more. But somewhere in the shadows, he knew change was stirring. The fear that had gripped this town for so long was finally beginning to break. And Mac Davis wasn't about to let it take hold again. Mac's body moved like a seasoned warrior, each step calculated, every strike precise. Derek came at him first, swinging a wild right hook. Mac ducked under it smoothly, pivoting on his foot to step inside Derek's reach. With a sharp, controlled strike to Derek's chest, Mac sent him stumbling backward, gasping for air. It wasn't a strike meant to harm, it was meant to teach. A reminder that Derek was entirely outmatched. Jake saw the opportunity and lunged in from the side. This time, his approach was more tactical. Aiming low, Jake drove a punch toward Mac's midsection. But Mac anticipated the move. Sidestepping fluidly, he caught Jake's wrist mid-swing and twisted it sharply. Jake fell to his knees with a pained grunt. "You're too predictable," Mac said, his voice calm yet cutting. He released Jake with a shove, sending him tumbling into a parked car. The vehicle rattled from the impact, and Jake slumped to the ground, groaning. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely. Recovering his breath, Derek's eyes landed on a metal pipe lying near the truck. Grabbing it tightly, his knuckles turned white as he swung it with all his strength. The pipe whistled through the air, missing Mac's head by inches as he dodged. Another swing came, lower this time, but Mac sidestepped again, his movements as fluid as water. On the third swing, Mac stepped inside Derek's reach and seized the pipe with one hand, yanking it free. Derek stumbled forward, off balance, as Mac spun the pipe in his hand once before tossing it aside with a loud clang. The sound echoed in the still night. "You need more than a weapon to take me down," Mac said, his voice unwavering. And even then, it wouldn't be enough. Derek's face twisted with frustration and rage, but the fear flickering in his eyes betrayed him. He lunged again, fists swinging wildly. Mac deflected each strike with ease, his forearms absorbing the blows as if they were nothing. Then, with a calculated uppercut, Mac sent Derek sprawling to the ground. Derek lay there, clutching his jaw, glaring up at Mac with a mix of humiliation and fury. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his earlier bravado shattered. "You done?" Mac asked, his tone steady, almost casual. Before Derek could respond, Jake groaned and pushed himself off the ground. His steps were sluggish, his body battered, but his pride drove him forward. He charged at Mac, his movements clumsy but desperate. Mac met him with a firm hand planted on his chest, shoving him backward with controlled force. Jake tripped over the curb and landed hard on his back, groaning. Evan remained frozen near the truck. His hands hovered indecisively, his eyes darting between his two fallen companions and Mac. The fear in his expression was palpable. "Evan," Mac called out, his voice softer now, though it carried the same authority. "You don't have to be a part of this. Walk away." Evan's trembling hands lowered slightly, his breathing shaky. I don't want this," he muttered, barely audible. "Then leave," Mac said. "Now." Evan hesitated, his gaze darting to Derek, whose glare burned with contempt. "Coward," Derek spat, his voice hoarse. "You're dead, Evan. You hear me?" Evan's resolve faltered for only a moment before he turned and jogged away into the shadows, his retreat punctuated by Derek's curses. Mac's attention shifted back to Derek, who was still sprawled on the ground. Crouching down, Mac loomed over him, his voice low and deliberate. "You've been beaten," Mac said. "Take the loss. Walk away. Don't make this worse." Derek's glare burned with humiliation, but he didn't move to attack again. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his movements stiff and pained. Glancing at Jake, who remained sprawled on the curb, Derek cursed under his breath. "You'll regret this," Derek spat, his voice trembling but full of venom. "We know where you live. This isn't over." Mac stood tall, his expression unchanging. "Try it," he replied evenly, "and you'll see just how over it is." Derek grabbed Jake's arm, hauling him to his feet. Together, they limped down the street, muttering curses and threats under their breath. Mac watched them go, his chest rising and falling steadily as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. He didn't relax until the street was silent once more. The fight was over, but the battle wasn't. Derek's threats hung in the air like a storm cloud, promising more trouble to come. Later that night, Mac sat in his living room nursing a cup of coffee. The events replayed in his mind, the wild swings, the threats, and most importantly, Evan's hesitation. The youngest of the trio hadn't truly committed to the confrontation, and his retreat had spoken volumes. Evan was scared, not of Mac, but of Derek. Mac leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. If Derek and his gang were going to be dismantled, it wouldn't be by brute force alone. Fear had kept the town silent for too long. Mac needed someone on the inside, someone who could expose Derek's operation, and he knew exactly who that someone was. Mac nodded once, his mind still racing from the whirlwind of recent events. His body was tense, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but there was a flicker of something in his chest, hope. It was a dangerous thing, a feeling he'd rarely allowed himself. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the tide was shifting. As he reviewed Evan's confession once more that evening, the pieces of the puzzle started to align. With the information in his hands, Mac now had a clear path forward to break Derek's grip on the town. But he also knew this wasn't the end. Far from it. The hardest part of the fight was still ahead. When he turned off the recorder, a rare smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't one of satisfaction, but of cautious optimism. For the first time, he could see the cracks in Derek's empire. The night had felt like a victory, but Mac knew it was merely the opening act. The real battle was yet to unfold. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Mac's living room, casting long shadows across the floor as he prepped for the next phase. Evan's confession had been like a map, revealing the depths of Derek's operation, the intimidation, the fear, the web of corruption that had kept the town under its thumb for so long. But Mac knew a confession alone wouldn't suffice. What he needed now was a way to turn the town's silence into action. He needed to make sure that no one could ignore the truth any longer. And the first step, going public. His first stop was the office of Eric Martin, a local journalist who had built a reputation for digging into the town's quieter corners. Eric, young and still eager but with a palpable nervous energy, was hunched over his desk when Mac stepped into his modest office. "You again," Eric said, standing quickly, his eyes narrowing. "What's this about now?" Mac placed a folder on the desk and tapped it with purpose. "This is about the truth. You want a story that matters? Here it is." Eric opened the folder, scanning the pages quickly. His brow furrowed with every line, his curiosity growing as he read. He paused when Mac handed him a recorder. "What's this?" Eric asked, glancing up. "Evan." "He's confessed everything," Mac said simply. "Vandalism, threats, Derek's connections, everything. Play it." Eric hesitated for a moment, but then pressed play. Evan's shaky voice filled the room, recounting incidents of intimidation, violence, and corruption. Mac watched closely, noting how Eric's face shifted, first cautious, then incredulous, and finally enraged. When the recording stopped, Eric leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. "This is big," Eric said, his voice low. "This is more than big," Mac replied. "This is your chance to expose what's been happening here. People need to know they're not alone. Derek and his crew can't keep running this town." Eric nodded slowly, the weight of the story sinking in. "I'll need to fact-check some of this," he said, his tone more resolved now. "But if it holds up, I'll run it. And I'll push it to regional outlets. This story won't stay local." "Good," Mac said, standing to leave. "The more people know, the harder it'll be for them to sweep it under the rug." Mac's next stop was the police station. He'd seen the indifference before, but now, with Evan's confession and a detailed summary of Derek's activities in hand, he was ready to force their hand. He needed to make sure the system would act. The desk officer, a man in his 40s with a tired face, looked up when Mac approached. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak to someone in charge of investigations," Mac said firmly. The officer hesitated for a moment, then nodded. A few minutes later, Mac found himself sitting across from Detective Collins, a grizzled man with a skeptical gaze. The detective's eyes narrowed as Mac slid the folder across the desk. "This better be good," Collins muttered, flipping open the folder. "It's more than good," Mac replied, his voice steady. "It's proof." Collins flipped through the pages, his face unreadable until he stopped at the transcript of Evan's confession. "Evan Knight, huh?" he said, glancing up at Mac. "He's one of Derek's boys." "Not any more," Mac replied, his tone firm. "He's ready to testify." Collins leaned back, crossing his arms, his face a mask of skepticism. "You've got a lot here. But you know how this works. Evidence doesn't mean much if the people pulling the strings are still in power." "That's why I came to you," Mac said, leaning in slightly. "If you want to do your job, you've got what you need. If not, I'll take this to someone who will." Collins's jaw tightened, but after a long pause, he nodded. "Leave this with me. I'll see what I can do." Mac left the station, the detective's response not a guarantee but a step forward. That, for now, was enough. The ripple effect of Evan's confession spread quickly. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs grew into full-blown conversations. People who had been silent for so long began to speak out, quietly at first, but more boldly as the days wore on. Mac walked through town and saw the shift. Business owners who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to thank him. Neighbors who had kept their heads down for years pulled him aside to share their own stories of Derek's threats. "I always thought no one would care," one man admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But seeing you stand up to him, maybe it's time we all did." "The more people speak out, the less power they have," Mac said, placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "We do this together." By the end of the week, the town was buzzing. Eric's article hit the local paper, its headline bold and uncompromising. "Small town, big secrets. The reign of Derek Hastings and his crew." The story laid bare the gang's crimes, their connections, and the complicity of those who had turned a blind eye for far too long. The response was immediate. Business owners and residents came forward with their own stories, adding to the growing pressure on Derek and his allies. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. But Mac knew it wasn't over. Derek wasn't the type to sit back and accept defeat. The next move would be his. But Mac would be ready. Later that evening, as Mac sat on his porch, the air thick with anticipation, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and read the message from Detective Collins. Warrant signed. "We're moving in tonight." Be ready if we need you. Mac read the message twice, his resolve hardening. This was the moment they had all been working toward. He grabbed his jacket and stepped off the porch, heading for his truck. He needed to be there when it happened. The scene was set at Derek's usual haunt, a run-down garage on the outskirts of town, which had long served as their base of operations. Mac parked a few streets away, his vantage point offering a clear view of the police assembling near the garage. Their movements were deliberate, a mix of uniformed officers and plainclothes detectives positioning themselves strategically. Detective Collins stepped out of an unmarked car, speaking into his radio. His gaze swept the area, locking onto Mac's truck for a moment before he approached. "You didn't have to come," Collins said, his voice low but laced with respect. Mac's gaze was steady, his posture unwavering. "You know I had to," he said. "Let's end this." Mac's words cut through the crowd like a blade, his voice steady but carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the gathering. The people of the town, those who had lived under Derek's reign for so long, felt something shift in the air, a ripple of change that ran deep and undeniable. They had been afraid for so long, afraid to speak out, afraid to stand up. But now, with Mac leading the charge, they felt the ground beneath their feet finally start to solidify. "It's not just Derek or his crew," Mac continued, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd. "It's the people who stood by and let this happen. The ones who were too scared, too comfortable, or too indifferent to do what needed to be done. That ends now." The crowd stirred, the murmurs of agreement growing louder, emboldened by Mac's call to action. It wasn't just about a handful of men. This was about breaking a cycle, about reclaiming what had been taken from them for years. An older man stepped forward, his hand trembling but his eyes fierce. "We've all suffered under them," he said, his voice cracking. "It's time we show the town what happens when you stand up." Mac nodded, his gaze softening for a moment. "Exactly. This isn't just about justice for the few. It's about justice for all of us." Eric Martin, who had been quietly observing the scene, stepped up with his notepad in hand, the weight of the moment settling in. "You've already got the story, Mac," he said, his voice firm. "It's time to make sure the rest of the world hears it. We won't be silenced anymore." Mac gave a small nod, acknowledging Eric's words. The tide had truly turned, but the war was far from over. Derek's father still held power, and the forces working against them weren't going to back down easily. But as the crowd rallied around Mac, sharing their stories of fear and defiance, he felt something shift inside him. They were no longer just victims. They were fighters. By the time Mac returned to the police station later that afternoon, the pressure was mounting. Detective Collins was buried under a pile of paperwork, his phone ringing off the hook with calls from Derek's father's legal team, each one more insistent than the last. But despite the chaos, Collins remained focused. "You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest," Collins said, gesturing for Mac to sit. The exhaustion was evident in his face, but so was a quiet determination. "Good," Mac replied. "The more noise they make, the guiltier they look." Collins cracked a faint smile, but it quickly faded as he leaned back in his chair. "The DA's on board, but we're going to need more to make this stick. Derek's dad's pulling out all the stops, and the pressure's coming down hard. We've got the confession, the evidence, and witnesses coming forward, but public support is key now." Mac leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Then we get that. People are tired of being afraid. They're ready for change." Collins nodded, his gaze heavy with understanding. "We'll need that support in full force. If the town backs us, it'll be harder for them to wriggle out of this." The afternoon sun hung low over the town square as Mac stood at the steps of the community center, his arms crossed, his mind focused on the task at hand. The crowd that had gathered was larger than he expected, the people coming forward to speak out, sharing their stories of intimidation, fear, and the silent complicity that had allowed Derek and his crew to operate with impunity for so long. Eric Martin, standing off to the side, was scribbling furiously in his notebook, capturing every word, every moment. This was the heart of it. This was where the shift would happen. A woman in her 60s stepped forward, her voice trembling but full of conviction. "For years they've been tearing this town apart," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "My shop was vandalized 3 times last year. And every time I went to the police, nothing happened. It's about time someone did something." Her words rippled through the crowd like a spark, lighting a fire in those who had kept silent for so long. A man in his 40s nodded, stepping forward. "They slashed my tires when I refused to donate to their so-called fundraisers. I didn't think anyone would ever stand up to them." Mac's eyes swept over the crowd, seeing the faces of those who had been beaten down, the faces of the townspeople who were finally finding their voice. He could feel the anger, the fear, and most importantly, the hope building in the air around them. When the murmurs quieted, Mac stepped forward. His deep voice rang out, steady and resolute. "This isn't just about Derek or his gang," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, locking eyes with those who had gathered to listen. "This is about the people who let it happen, the ones who turned a blind eye because it was easier than doing the right thing. That ends now." There was a long pause, the weight of his words settling over them like a blanket. Slowly, the crowd began to stir, a sense of unity growing among them. They weren't just victims anymore. They were fighters. And together, they were ready to take back their town. The rest of the day passed in a blur of planning, of phone calls, and of quiet conversations among the town's leaders. Mac knew that they were just getting started. Derek's reign might be over, but the true battle was about to begin. The system that had enabled his rise, the apathy, the fear, the complicity, was far from dismantled. But Mac wasn't going to stop until it was. The night fell over the town, the stars overhead a silent witness to the changing tides. For the first time in years, Mac could feel the weight of the future pressing against his chest, not as a burden, but as a promise. They had taken the first step, and they would finish this, no matter what it took. The stakes were rising with every passing hour. As Mac and Eric exchanged glances, the tension between them was palpable, both of them knowing just how critical this next move was. Robert Hastings' public display of confidence was nothing more than a desperate attempt to reclaim control, to turn the tide in his favor. But Mac wasn't about to let that happen. "We keep pushing," Mac said, his voice steady. "They can't control this narrative anymore. We'll use this mess to show everyone who's really been pulling the strings." Eric nodded, pulling out his phone to check the latest developments. "I've got eyes on the council now. We'll need a solid link to the shell accounts, but once we have it, it'll be undeniable." Mac's mind raced. He knew that the pressure was building on the Hastings family, but it was clear they were still dangerous, using every resource at their disposal to stay on top. They had the influence, but Mac had the town's support, and now they had a lead. The following days felt like a sprint. The town was buzzing with rumors, and Mac could feel the shifting momentum. People who had once kept their heads down were now standing up, speaking out, and supporting the case. It was like a spark had ignited, and the fire was spreading. Back at the Hastings estate, Robert paced the floors of his mansion, seething with fury. His lawyers had failed him so far, and he wasn't about to let a handful of accusations destroy everything his family had built. But his frustration was palpable. Derek was no longer the bold, confident heir to the family empire. He was a liability. Robert's once pristine reputation was being tarnished before his eyes, and the pressure was mounting from all sides. "I'm telling you, I want that investigation shut down now." Robert barked at his lead attorney, his voice dripping with anger. The lawyer, though tense, remained calm. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Hastings. The DA's office is under intense scrutiny, and the public sentiment is turning against us." Derek, sitting silently nearby, looked up, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Dad, they won't keep us in here. You'll fix it, right?" Robert glanced at his son, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating his next move. Derek's once cocky demeanor had crumbled, and the cracks in his father's power were becoming more apparent. For the first time, Robert realized that his influence might not be enough to cover up the truth. Meanwhile, Mac was on a mission. The town's energy was palpable, and he could feel the support growing. On the streets, people were no longer speaking in hushed tones. They were speaking out loud. The fear that had kept them silenced for so long had been replaced by a fierce determination, and Mac was determined to see it through. The phone call from Eric was the push Mac needed. "We've got something," Eric said, urgency in his voice. "I've been digging through the council records. Hastings' uncle has been funneling money through shell accounts tied to town projects. If we can tie this to Derek's operation, it'll blow this whole thing wide open." Mac's heart skipped a beat. This was the break they'd been waiting for. "How long do you need?" Mac asked, his voice sharp with resolve. "Not long," Eric replied. "I'm close. Just need a little more time to connect the dots." Mac hung up the phone, a sense of purpose flooding through him. This was the key to dismantling the Hastings empire once and for all. But he knew they couldn't wait long. Robert Hastings was already mobilizing, trying to spin the narrative in his favor. Mac wouldn't give him the chance. At City Hall, Robert Hastings was preparing to make his move. The press conference he'd called was designed to regain control, to rally his supporters and silence his critics. But Mac knew that this was only the beginning of a much bigger fight. Standing in the back of the crowd, Mac watched as Robert approached the podium, his silver hair gleaming under the midday sun, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the rough-and-tumble citizens of the town. Robert's voice carried the weight of authority, and as he spoke, Mac could hear the arrogance in his words. "This past week has been a shameful display of overreach and baseless accusations," Robert began, his tone cold but smooth. "My son Derek has been wrongfully accused, and I will not stand idly by while his reputation is dragged through the mud." Mac's jaw tightened as he listened. Robert was doubling down on his lies, trying to turn the tide with his usual manipulative charm. But this time, it wasn't working. Some of the people in the crowd were skeptical, their faces showing the cracks in Robert's story. "Can you believe this guy?" Mac muttered under his breath, noticing a few council members shifting uncomfortably. The cracks were starting to show, and Mac wasn't going to let up now. Robert's voice rose as he continued, trying to rally his supporters. "My family has dedicated generations to this community. We will not be intimidated by false narratives." As the press conference ended, Mac moved quickly through the crowd, his eyes locking with Eric, who was standing near the back, his notebook in hand. "They're doubling down," Mac said, his tone low but firm. Eric nodded, looking around before leaning in closer. "But people are starting to question them. Did you see the looks on some of the council members' faces? They're rattled. And I've got something else." He pulled out his phone. "Hastings' uncle is involved in funneling money through town projects, shell accounts. If we can link this to Derek's operations, we've got them." Mac's heart raced. This was the break they needed. "How long?" "Not long," Eric replied. "I'm on it." The stage was set. The Hastings family was on the defensive, and Mac could feel the tide turning. The cracks in their power were widening, and with Eric's findings, they would have the evidence to take them down. But Mac knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be easy. The fight had only just begun. Max's voice rang out clearly in the hushed courtroom. His words carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment. For years, the Hastings family had cast a long shadow over the town, and for far too long, people had been silenced by fear, intimidated into compliance. But Max wasn't scared anymore. Someone had to, he repeated, his gaze unwavering as he met the eyes of those in the gallery. This town had been living under their shadow for too long. People were scared. The weight of his words settled in the room. There was a murmur of agreement, a ripple of support. The tension that had gripped the town for years was now in the open, and the people were no longer hiding. Valerie Knight, the prosecutor, nodded approvingly. She knew how important Max's testimony was. It wasn't just about Derek anymore. It was about the entire Hastings family, about dismantling the system that had allowed them to operate unchecked, to terrorize the town without consequence. Max's testimony continued to build the case, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the chaos Derek's defense attorney was trying to stir up. The defense lawyer, slick and practiced, tried to cast doubt on the evidence, painting Derek as a victim of a vendetta. "This is nothing more than a witch hunt," he argued, his voice smooth and insistent. "My client is being scapegoated for the mistakes of others." But Valerie was ready, countering with the testimony of victims who had suffered under the Hastings family's rule. Each person who spoke out added more weight to the case, more proof of the corruption that had festered in the town for far too long. When it was Evan's turn to testify, his nervousness was palpable. But as he spoke, his voice grew stronger. The young man, once terrified and unsure, was now telling the truth, his words piercing through the defenses the Hastings family had built around themselves. "I went along with it because I was scared," Evan admitted, his eyes steady on the prosecutor. "But it wasn't just us messing around. Derek had his father's backing. We did things because we knew no one would stop us." The room fell silent as Evan described the harassment, the vandalism, the intimidation tactics the Hastings family had used to maintain their power. It wasn't just about bullying. It was about fear, control, and the abuse of authority. And Evan's testimony painted Derek as more than just a rebellious youth. He was a product of a corrupt legacy, one that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for far too long. When Valerie asked about the financial trail, Evan hesitated only for a moment. The glare from Robert Hastings, seated near the front of the courtroom, was ice-cold, but Max's steady gaze from the gallery seemed to ground him. Evan took a deep breath and spoke the truth. "There were payments," Evan said, his voice stronger now. "Money from fake invoices, donations to projects that never happened. Derek's uncle handled most of it, but everyone knew it was to keep people quiet or make them go away." The courtroom buzzed with a mix of disbelief and anger. The Hastings family's grip on the town was slipping, and now, with this revelation, it was clear that the corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The defense, though desperate, couldn't keep up. Derek's lead attorney tried to deflect, trying to twist the narrative, but the evidence was too strong. It wasn't just about Derek's crimes. It was about the web of deceit and corruption that had allowed those crimes to happen. One after another, victims took the stand, each testimony adding more pieces to the puzzle. Business owners who had been silenced, residents who had feared retaliation. All of them came forward, no longer willing to live in fear. And then, finally, it was Mac's turn. As he walked to the stand, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. His presence was steady, unwavering, like he'd been through this before. His eyes scanned the room briefly before locking onto Valerie. The prosecutor's question was simple, direct. "You provided evidence to the police," she said. "What motivated you to take that step?" Mac's gaze swept over the room, over the gallery filled with people who had been waiting for this day for years. His voice was calm, firm. "Because someone had to," he said again. "People were scared. But no more." His words were a rallying cry, not just for the people in the room, but for the entire town. They had been living in fear for far too long, but now, finally, the truth was coming out. And the Hastings family, once so powerful, was being exposed for what they truly were. Mac knew the battle wasn't over. The courtroom battles would continue, and the Hastings family wouldn't go down without a fight. But for the first time, victory felt within reach. The case was building to a climax, but the fight wasn't over yet. Robert Hastings still had his wealth, his power, and his influence, and Mac knew that this wouldn't be easy. But the town was no longer silent. People were standing up, speaking out, and supporting the truth. The Hastings family's empire was crumbling, and Mac was determined to see it through to the end. Mac stood in the community center, surrounded by the energy of a town that was starting to find its footing again. The weight of everything that had happened, the trials, the struggles, the fear, all of it had come to a head. And now, in this moment, it felt like the beginning of something new, something better. The Hastings family's grip was loosening, and the town was beginning to breathe again. As he wiped his hands on a towel, Sandra approached, her casual tone hiding the deeper question she was about to ask. "You're staying, aren't you?" Her voice had a weight to it, like she was asking for more than just an answer. She was asking for hope. Hope for the town. Hope for the future. Max paused, his eyes scanning the room. It was a small gym, a humble space, but now it felt different. There were notices on the bulletin board, things that spoke to the town's recovery, community events, business fairs, even a celebration of resilience. The signs of life were there, and they were loud. The fear and silence that had stifled the town for so long were starting to dissipate, and it was hard not to feel the pull of it. He had thought about leaving. After all, he came here as an outsider. His mission had always been to bring justice, and with Derek and his crew behind bars, the fight against the Hastings family was well underway. There was no obligation for him to stay, no reason to remain rooted in a place that wasn't originally his own. But as he looked around, he realized that the town was beginning to rebuild itself. People were finding their voices again, standing up for each other, for what was right. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice steady and sure. "I think I'll stick around." Sandra smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached her eyes. It was genuine, a smile born from relief, from the knowledge that this town wasn't broken. It was healing. "Good," she said, her tone lighter now. "We need people like you." Max didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change that had already begun. This town needed people willing to stand up, to fight for the future, and for the first time, he knew he was part of that future. The work wasn't done. The Hastings family's influence still loomed, and there were more battles ahead. But the foundation had been laid, and with it, the promise of something different. As the day drew to a close, Mac found himself reflecting on everything that had brought him here, the risks, the sacrifices, the struggles. He had given this town a chance to fight back, to reclaim its voice. And now, for the first time, it felt like a place worth fighting for. The night was clear, the stars brighter than they had been in weeks. Max sat on his porch, his mind at ease for the first time in a long while. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the town had hope now, and that was enough. The town had a chance to heal, and he'd be there to see it through, every step of the way. The following days brought a quieter atmosphere than Mac had anticipated. The town had changed, yes, but it was still in the process of healing. Derek and his crew were behind bars, and the Hastings family's influence was under intense scrutiny. The town felt different, though not completely. It was like a wound that had started to heal, but there was still work to be done. Max, as he stood in the community center, couldn't help but notice the difference. The once stifled whispers and cautious glances had been replaced by voices that were lighter, more open. The bulletin board was a testament to that, a far cry from the oppressive silence that had once ruled the town. Sandra's approach, her casual question, reminded him that the fight was never just about one trial or one family. It was about the entire town finding its voice again. And Max knew, as he looked around, that this town was on the verge of something new. Something stronger. What's next for the town now that Derek and his crew are behind bars? Should we continue to focus on the town's recovery, or dive deeper into the ongoing investigations into Robert Hastings and his brother?